Welcome to the SIG for St. Patrick's Day, March 17th, 2025. And we're here, we're gonna collect some people here, and I guess the topic is going to be a continuation of the conversation around the working document we've been putting together on the SIG and some of the requirements for long-term support and what that might look like and how we could address it. And I know I've commented on it this weekend. I know there's been a lot of comments in the discussion, and I can see a lot of faces here, which is epic. Thank you, Oscar and Andrew, for coming along. I know you guys promised you would, and I really appreciate you guys being here. So, and that's pretty cool. And I know there's been conversations going on between Stephen and Luke about how things can evolve, and they've been pretty exciting. And I've got part of that conversation from Stephen, and I think it would be really cool to talk about that a little bit more. And for me, I guess, I think the document's done a really good job of kicking off a conversation, which is good. It is very big, covers a lot of bases, and Oscar made a really good observation that we should try and simplify it into something else. And going back and looking at our charter, we do have the commitment to supply technical notes on the requirements of the SIG and how it might work. And it seems this document kind of definitely covers one base, might straddle a second, maybe not completely, but certainly there looks like there's at least two documents in this one. So my hope had been to kind of get the summation of the views on this document in, commit it as a working document, and then move forward on something that we can actually present at the subgroup for a wider discussion, maybe initially on the requirements that the SIG have without a discussion on how we'd address them. Just these are the requirements that sets the sort of solution space that we have, and then have a second document that would go into a bit more depth and probably take a little bit longer to hash out on how we would go about addressing those concerns. And that was kind of my idea at the moment, but I would love the feedback from the guys who've read the document and commented, and in person, that would be amazing. It would be really good. So I'm going to open the floor to conversation, and we can take it from there.
I'll kick it off. I think, I do agree the document's a great conversation starter, and I think that's been good. I think actually moving it into a pull request has been a good move, even though it's created an impossible to follow discussion, but that's good, right? We actually started to have the discussion. I agree with the sentiment of like trying to make it simpler. I think there's various parts to it, some with which I agree more, others less. But I definitely see that there, in the core of it, there's a need that's trying to be expressed, right? And I'm, sympathetic to that need of like high performance, low overhead access to hardware primitives, and that has to get figured out, right? Like, and the embedded SIG is actually a good user of those, saying, "Hey, we need this," right? So that's great. I think that's the best part that I see in the document.
Well,
yeah. All right, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I can, it's writing these documents is never easy, right? And in part, the document is trying to express a sense of urgency around needing to address this, because I think I think as we move forward in the standards, people tend to think, oh, we can solve this in the future. And it's true, you can, but then everybody sits and waits for somebody else to solve it. So I'm trying to, well, at least my contributions to that document are trying to inject a kind of sense of urgency. There's a timeline here, and we need to be involved, and we need to be contributing, at least from the embedded side, a bit more, to try and get that commitment to contribute. So it's a hard one. You don't want to say everything's terrible, but you don't want to say everything's good because it needs the investment to get where we want to go. So it's kind of trying to call out that gap and trying to get the balance right. As I know, there's I get the sense there's some built up tension on both sides, and it's like, hey, that's not the important bit. The important bit is where we are and what we need to do to move forward. So let's try and express it that way. And I'm aware that some of the earlier versions of the document might have veered too far to one side, and that wasn't its intention. But it was good to get called out and hopefully corrected. So now we're talking about the problems and not talking about the frustration. So that's the end goal, really, is to move past that bit. But it's I appreciate Andrew's help in the wordsmithing of some of the stuff
Yeah.
because it's hard.
Sorry to nitpick on some of that, but I know the people who we're talking about. So I was kind of like, hey, they're,
Yeah. No, it's good. It's good. It's hard. I mean, I think in the discussions, I can see people try to be polite, not trying to put words in your mouth. I'm like, no, I really want the help because this is like it's
Yeah.
hard to do. Right? So I appreciate it.
Yeah, I think the big thing for me was I really wanted to make sure we're separating out the things that are actionable right now versus work that has to be done in standards that's going to take time. Because I think there's a lot of progress that we can start making right now, a lot of things that we can go and implement, a lot of different optimizations and things like that that we can do today. And so I just want to make sure that we're tracking those so we can say, hey, we're actually going and like putting some hours on these things and like burning down any like existing technical debt we have. So that way we can at least get to that good place while we're, on the other side going and working through the standards process to say, okay, here's some, bigger, more sweeping changes that we want to make. So that was the focus of what I was trying to say.
Yeah, I think one of the concerns that's coming up is that, well, we have products that are in the market that are 0.1 now, or P1, whatever you want to call it, based. And there are others of us about to launch products based on that because it meets the requirements we have today. And then there's a commercial need to go to market with something. So we're going to market with that because P2, P3, RC1's not there yet. And so there is this happening. And then there's like, oh, I've got P1. It has almost everything I want. I want this, and this. And you can see this pressure coming to add that. So I can see that coming, and then I can see the roadmap to RC1 in the future. But there's a commercial need for something for today. So it's this hard balance. And it's like, well, what's the best way to go about this? And that's where we get into the sort of solutioneering bit of the document, where it's like, how do I balance these two things together? We don't want to fragment, but we need to go to market. So that it's kind of it's a tough call. It's a tough call. But one of the as somebody who's talking to people who are adopting the technology or looking at adopting WebAssembly, the messaging from the WASI group in total, I'm not picking on anybody here, but the messaging in the WASI group is kind of, well, don't use P1 because it's not really meant to go into production, but it's usable. But P2 is better, but it's not ready. Wait for P3, it's going to be even better, but it's not ready. And it's this stagnation. And I've had a number of phone calls, both inside and outside of my organization, with people saying, well, is it ready should I use it? How I don't understand what's happening. And that messaging it's pushing some people away, or at least stagnant. Thank you. I'm looking for the word for not moving. It's limiting that ability to get the investment to move forward, and that's part of the challenge as well. And that perhaps came across as a bit of frustration in the document. Where you can see that being expressed. It's just like, hey, I'm trying to get the money and the commitment from my stakeholders to allow me to move forward. And I feel like I'm battling a headwind because I know the messaging here is meant for the internal community driving the standards forward, but the external community is looking at it going, I shouldn't adopt it yet. And that's the conflict that's happening. when I talk to people who aren't familiar with the WASI group and they're outsiders looking in, going, is this technology ready to move on with? Should I look at it? Should I invest in it? Where should I invest in it? What's going on with this? And that's, but
Yeah, the messaging is definitely it's a tough point. I think for all the folks who've been working on WASI, for this time, it's been the matter of, hey, as things are being devved, like we're just shipping that to production. We're just shipping it, and then when we keep deving it, new stuff comes out, we try that, we ship it. But I think the big thing is like for the people who have been, working on WASI and implementing these things, have had the mindset of, hey, yeah, we know that this isn't the end all solution. We're going to keep building towards, the newer thing to get to this point that we want to get to. And so that's where like the sort of disconnect happens, right? Because I think in terms of WASI Preview 1, it's not the case that, it's not production ready or that you can't run it in production. Plenty of us have run it in production to great levels of success. It's mostly the matter of supportability, which is where we get into, the big crux of it here is, what's the supportability plan? And I think the big idea behind Preview 1 was, well, we don't really plan to continue to support this. We want to continue to develop the standard and keep moving forward. But obviously, for folks who are planning on shipping stuff on Preview 1, you do want to make sure that you're in a place to say, hey, actually, am I going to be okay being in this Preview 1 place, for a extended period of time? And what level of updates am I looking for, right? Because there's like the small ones of, hey, actually, yeah, the only thing I care about are critical vulnerabilities. Like CVE comes out, I want to make sure, that sort of type of thing is addressed. But other than that, I'm fine with this. And then there's the next phase of which is, oh, actually, maybe I want to continue building on top of this. Maybe there's a few more APIs I might want. And then that's where it gets a little bit trickier, right? And so I think that's another thing is deciding how happy are we with the interface as it stands today, because it seems like it has largely worked for many of the embedded use cases. But I just sort of want to check in and see, like, if there's like, is there like, I don't know. Um, I don't think we need like fork or anything like that for embedded, but is there any other API or something like that that we say, oh, this is completely missing from Preview 1 and we would want like a Preview 1.2 or something that added something like that? Or is it mostly just about like performance and things like that?
so I've been talking to Stephen. I know he's not here. He's in the European time zone. So for those people watching the YouTube video, Stephen's in the European time zone and can't attend this one. But he's been going through this as well, and there are tables being produced of like, here's the missing functionality, here's what we would really need. And I don't have them to hand because they're not ready yet, but the high level of it, signal handling. There is thread support. Is it in? Isn't it in? It was kind of in, not in, but whatever's in Preview 1 that we're using is kind of what there is. So there's that. And then there's some WASI socket work in there too. And then even with that, there are things like, hey, threading's really good, but I want prioritization on a per thread basis in a platform agnostic way. So it's nearly there, but not quite there. And can we add that? So there's bits and pieces like that you can see sort of on the horizon. Shared memory is another one. And some of this is just, I think every vendor is taking WebAssembly and WASI most in its entirety, and then some are extending it. Now, do those extensions become something that we want to either contribute back to WAMA and have available in WAMA, or are they things that we want to add to 0.1 for other runtimes? That's a different question, right? But there's bits and pieces that are happening here, and I know in a well functioning open source community, at some point we should all sit there and go, hey, we're all adding the same extensions. This is a bit daft, right? Why are we duplicating the work here? We should work together, and that should probably go to WAMA as a first step, and then whether or not it goes anywhere else is probably another conversation. But that's the stuff that's sort of coming along on that space. I don't think there's anything. There's nothing, no rocket science here. There's nothing weird or really unusual in it. But there are tiny little gotchas, and there are things I think that would be beneficial to share with the future RC1 implementation. Like, hey, threading's really cool, but not only do we want threading, we want thread prioritization, and we want maybe a real-time kernel thread for something, and we want a non-real-time low priority thread for something else. And being able to do that is really important. So having those mechanisms, and what we're getting is probably, you know, early use cases that could be implemented as WAMR contributions for preview 1, but would also be really valid requirement statements for future versions of WASI. So I see a lot of value in kind of sharing that. What I do see when we get into the sort of solution space is, you know, I think Luke's touched on it and Stephen's been talking to me about it too. There's been some conversations about if we were going to add anything at all, regardless of whether it goes to WAMR or if it goes to beyond that, should we try and define that in an IDL rather than just handwriting it in a header file? Most of what we're doing is C and C++, so we can just put it in a header file, but should we do that? And then if we do it that way, how do we express it? And what's the best way to do that? And would that be useful to contribute again towards the future RC1 candidate? But like, here you go. This is what we've got so far. This is what this end of the community is asking for.
You're saying as opposed to the WIT interface
Yeah, there's been
language?
Yeah, so there's been some discussion about it. No, I'm not 100% on this. So the conversation that I've seen going around is, well, the WIT spec says it's only for component model renderings, and we're not going to render everything as a component model rendering for 0.1. So could we use it? Should we use it? Is it just add a tagline onto the spec document, or is it like, is there something fundamental in here? But those are the questions.
Can all the preview 1 interfaces be expressed as WIT? Don't you think, Luke?
Yeah, I mean, that's the preview 1 to 2 adapter shows that
Yeah.
constructively. Now you can dig into the details and say, is it as optimally performant as I want it to be? And that's where there's some of these ABI improvements that we want to make. So the WIT doesn't change, but the ABI can be improved. And I think decoupling these is the great thing about having an IDL that's separate from the low level ABI. So you can automate all that otherwise very unsafe, laborious code. So that's the interesting question, I think, where we want to enumerate what are the things that we still have remaining concerns of how concretely am I going to express signals? I think we've got a great answer brewing now. So be happy to talk that with anyone when it comes out in a doc. We can dig into that and then have our discussion and have a plan of record of this is how we would solve signals and so forth for every other concrete issue. I'm confident we can discuss each one, and then we can look at the whole thing and say, okay, if we are able to do each one of these chunks of work, that adds up to putting us to where we want to be. Now, that will take some amount of time. Do we want to do something in the interim? And maybe that is a WAMR specific thing. That's like a prototype that says, okay, we do this for now because we can do this immediately. And then we converge with the standard in the future. That's one option. Or we can say, oh, actually, for a first release, all you need is this one and this. And maybe we just knock those out now. And then maybe we don't need an intermediate thing. Maybe we go, straight to some standard based, So that's, I guess, once we have a document that enumerates all of our concrete concerns and we can prioritize them and see, t-shirt size of them, then I think we could have better answers to those.
I like the idea of decoupling because, some of these, requirements when we dig into them, it's just, for example, someone chose WAMR or someone chose WASM-Edge, or it's not a specific runtime, and that's kind of like determining. So the specific choice of runtime we should decouple that from some of these other things, right? It'd be great to kind of have the things separately, because if the good thing about WebAssembly is you can change your runtime. So yeah, except for those who've deployed the runtime to millions of devices, and they can't, unfortunately, change the runtime. But for example, you, Chris, you guys haven't deployed anything. You're not stuck, right, with a specific runtime. No?
We're not stuck yet, but I think it's just part and parcel of deploying hardware that's going to be customer owned and adopted. Not everybody takes the latest Microsoft Windows update or Mac OS update or iOS update, and there's always an old thing out there running. So for us, it's the same thing, right? Even when we release what we're planning, it's going to come with that moment in time snapshot for some customers that will remain for a while. And
Yeah. And
that,
that's another dimension to this too, right? That basically you have to snapshot your engine and you have to snapshot the tool chain around the engine as well, right? Because as we've seen, the tool chain will move ahead as new proposals get merged into WebAssembly core, new proposals get merged into WASI, the tool chain will move. And so maintaining this old engine and these old tool chains, that's another dimension kind of to explore here. That seems like a lot of work for if you're trying to snapshot, right?
yeah, well, we're gonna need to address it. So one of the discussion points that's been happening between internally and externally for some folks is, hey, should we have like a WAMA long-term support, an LTS WAMA release? And then if you're going to have a WAMA LTS release, and you're completely right, you've got the tool chain to think about.
Yeah.
And one of the things where I'm trying to express it in the document in the latest edits is looking out at, we have the tool chain which has preview 1 support at the moment, and I know my understanding is that it's primarily there because some of the P2, P3 work still depends on part of that. But I imagine once that's resolved and we have a cleaner pipeline, that the folks who are currently supporting all the stuff we're benefiting from will no longer really want to keep doing that. And then we should be doing that because we're going to need to do it anyway. So
Yeah, I was kind of trying to make that point in the comments there of the document that, you know, we can't slow down those who want to move to P3, P4, whatever P, right? If they want to move ahead, they should have the freedom to do so. And those who want to keep P1 or P2 or whatever alive have the then responsibility to, you know, put in the hours to maintain that, right?
yeah, and I think one of the perhaps next steps is for some, I've expressed an interest. I know Stephen's expressed an interest. A few others have too. Particularly because we're not that familiar with the tool chain of like, can we grab an hour with somebody who is to give us a breakdown of what it looks like and what the costs might, so we can start to understand the costs here and really get our heads around it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely possible.
But that would be awesome, just to get the head around that one. So I think that's probably going to be, you know, I appreciate you and Luke and Oscar being here, because I think you guys are the right ones to answer the question, you know, who should we talk to? So. Have a ghost.
Well, when it comes to WASI SDK and WASI libc and stuff like that, I think, you know, I can answer some of your questions. There's others, Alex, Sam, but especially Dan Goman, who's probably, I think, has appeared at in this meeting at some point in time, who could probably give you, you know, a consensus of those people would give you kind of a definitive answer for whatever question, or they'd say, I don't know, right? There's some of this is kind of future facing, like, we don't know how much support that would take, you know.
Right. That would be really good. So I think that's an action item for us to reach out to Dan or Alex and like, hey, a virtual cup of coffee. I will buy you a virtual cup of coffee for an hour of your expertise to get an understanding on this, just to really get the cost points. I think that'd be good. It'd be a really good way. I think
real quick, for the purposes of notes, just to make sure we've got the right names here, could somebody repeat last names there? I've got Dan, Alex, Kate, but I don't have last names.
I said Dan Goman,
Yep.
Alex Crichton, And then I think I said Sam Clegg,
Okay, I'm
probably.
not sure where I got Claire or Kate. Thanks.
You can put Kate in there too. I mean, I don't know. There's a Kate doing work here. So
Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll reach out to them and see if we can grab an hour at a time just to get up to speed. I think it'd be really good.
especially having them all together in one room would probably be good. Yeah.
Hmm. I know Martin has looked at it in a little bit of detail, but I haven't, so it would be really good. Just one of the things we're doing now, at least inside Siemens, is costings for what would the long time support look like? What would the developer effort be? Where do we need to contribute? So all that's happening at the moment. So it'd be really useful, actually. And
Yeah,
then
so that's like one whole dimension there. The other one is like, at what point do you want to snapshot? And you've mentioned, and the document mentions a lot, snapshotting at P1, right? And I've kind of wondered whether P2 might not be the better place to snapshot because of the WIT IDL. And I kind of wanted to pull you on that. Why is the only reason for snapshotting at P1 because of the choice of runtime, or are there other reasons?
there are a number of reasons. So yes, choice of runtime is a big one. Hey, I think we shared the original results and saw Nick Fitzgerald comment on it, and Nick and Thomas had a good conversation in the comments section of the document about performance. So right when we started our WebAssembly engagement, we did, let's look at what the performance and the footprint of 3 or 4 different runtimes were. And we took WAMR, WASMer, WASM-Time, WASM-3, I think at the time, and we just went through the whole lot, and we went JITs, AOT, interpreted mode, performance analysis, what does it look like, footprint, what does it look like, and for our requirements, for the performance requirements, for the size requirements, the footprint requirements, WAMR just happened to be the best fitting one. So we went, okay, WAMR is it, and then how stable is the WASI interfaces, and then that becomes, well, it's probably the one that's widely deployed right now, so we go with that one. So they're the influencing factors. Is, hey, it's widely deployed and used, it's stable relatively, it's hitting the performance requirements, and we've got a runtime that implements it, and that's basically it. But I have to say, one of the reasons for going for a standard rather than a single runtime in particular, and having the standard, is ultimately business continuity and having the ability to choose, and that's really important. So
Yeah, I think a lot of businesses should fight to keep the ability to choose, right? If you're, unless you're, tied to a single runtime, you probably want the ability to choose the runtime that fits best. And I kind of, I was kind of thinking when you're talking about you said WAMR fit the footprint requirements. I wonder, now that I've seen some of the work that Alex Crichton's done to like really reduce the footprint of WASM-Time, I don't really want to advocate for WASM-Time. That's not what I'm saying, but I think we want to do a really, really fair comparison, right? Like for example, if Alex was motivated to reduce the memory size of WASM-Time to its smallest size, like that would be the thing to compare against the others, right? For example, WASM-3 or whatever. Because sometimes, the doubt comes up in my mind, like, did we use the best possible configurations for some of these runtimes? You know?
You know, I think the work that's been done to shrink WASM time's been pretty awesome, and you know, hugely supportive of it. Really excited to see the announcements for it. There's probably an argument that says that, hey, you know, those performance and footprint benchmarks, we need to go and revisit those. And certainly, you know, the industry's changed since we did it. It was what, 2019, so it's a while ago now. So the industry's changed a fair bit.
Centuries ago.
Yeah.
But no, I understand. Like,
that truly is ages ago, in terms of what's happened with the runtimes.
So I just haven't had the budget or time to continue to
yeah,
but it's a fair point, right? And I think that gap is certainly closing. It's not quite there yet. You know, I think for an AOT WAMA build, it's 50 kilobytes or something. So it's super, super tiny.
yeah. Well, you know, one thing that would be great to upstream out of this document is benchmarks that, you know, whatever companies are, you know, contributing to the eSig, benchmarks that they think are representative of the types of workloads that would, you know, that you guys are going to use for evaluating runtimes, right? And the metrics, right? It's not, for example, I think one thing I'm kind of detecting is it might not just be execution speed of the compiled WebAssembly code, right? It might actually be the memory footprint or and you know, the contribution of those upstream and it's some benchmark suite, whether that be SiteGlass or some other place, you know, that would kind of be, that'd be great, right? Like then we can start measuring, and you could probably nerd snipe someone like Alex Creighton into, you know, seeing what is the best possible configuration for, you know,
Yeah.
for a certain runtime for this benchmark or whatever.
Yeah, that's a good idea. It's trying to express it in a, I think I was trying to do it in one of the comments in the document to Nick, and we're talking about performance and IO performance. I'm saying, well, actually, for a lot of the cyber physical control systems, you have a time allotment. I have so many microseconds or nanoseconds to reply. And so you're looking at that multiplied by the clock speed of the processor to give you a rough estimation of the number of instructions you've got available. And then you've got an instruction budget, and you've got your logic and your thinking and your, if you're going to stick some AI in there, your inference engine or whatever you want to do has to operate inside that on data you've got to consume from the outside world, and then actuations you have to affect in that world. So there's my input, there's my output, and there's my talk to the system, there's my talk out to the system. And that's when we suddenly look at it and go, oh, crumbs, yeah, if it's, you know, passing over a simple primitive, like a 32-point value, a 32-bit value, it's all right, okay, it's one memory operation, that's all good. If I've got, you know, hundreds of bytes I've got to consume, I don't want to copy them all because it's really starting to eat budget. But the percentage of that budget of instructions which is consumed by the IO, that's the bit where you get a lot of concern on it. And I know there's ways and means to get around that, but you get a lot of like, yeah. And I think in conversations with Luke, he's like, some of these writes are necessary. You do it regardless, and you're not consuming part of that budget. But other parts of it would be an additional copy.
Can I just ask a leading question here to everyone who's been involved in the document? Have we completely and clearly articulated that performance point? Like I've heard in the past concerns about the component model, you know, the passing of buffers between one side of a component to another side, that being a potential bottleneck. Has the document, or like, have we written that out in a way that, for example, Luke, you're happy with? It makes sense. We can write benchmarks too and stuff like that.
I think we could do with some specificity, particularly breaking down things in different cases, because there's not just one form of IO, right? Like even in any modern operating system, there's many different kinds of APIs and forms. So some things were already okay in preview 2, some things got better in preview 3, and some things we still need some follow-up fixes to get to these optimal points. But these are different cases. So different IO APIs are different use cases we've talked about, like a streaming pipeline that passes a 0-copy random access byte array between a chain of components. That's very different than bulk reading bytes from a network, the kind of solution. But I think each one has a different solution, and that could fit quite well in the component model. So it's useful to kind of to break down the different cases, because not everyone cares about every single case. What you need for WASI file system is distinct for this streaming pipeline of frames.
Yeah, something else that I've thought about in terms of thinking about components in the embedded case. I think there's been a lot of discussion about the canonical ABI sort of between components. But I think one of the things we have to consider is how much composing of components do we actually want to do for the embedded use case? Because I think in general, like if you do have separate modules that you want to link together with like shared everything linking, that then like a bunch of core WASMs and they become a component. I think that component with the current canonical ABI is probably pretty on par with just a regular core WASM. And so I think that's something to consider as well, because that might be something that maybe we haven't made the distinction between before. But I think it's an important one, because if the issues are component to component performance, that's something we can solve. But if it's just the performance of a single component with the host, that we're probably most of the way there already.
I think this may be something to add to a benchmarking suite, particularly in the embedded context. Run it all the way through on WASM time, get a sense of what the overheads really are. Because I think initially, at least for like some of our use cases, we looked at the canonical APIs, looked at the copies, and we're kind of said like, nope, and then
Yeah.
just proceeded to do something else. So it's definitely in the vein of let's go back and do more benchmarking. Now that it's 2025, I think this could be something to add to the list. Is what are we looking at? And again, do this in the context of the benchmarks that Andrew was talking about. What do we care about? Figure out what we're looking at overhead wise.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think especially like the host to guest is gonna be like, we can actually optimize that pretty well in the runtimes. Like, I think it's pretty different than component to component, which might like there might actually be issues doing that, and so maybe you can't have the dream of composing everything. But in terms of just being able to use WIT, be able to define your ABIs, or like your APIs for everything in WIT, be able to do your binding and everything, it'd be great if that just worked. Without having to do too much more.
One thing I've noticed when talking through some concrete use cases with folks is they'll read some of the literature and it'll look like, oh, a copy is being made here, an extra copy that's in between, one beyond what I was doing already. And that can be just an artifact of how things are specified. And, just as an example, if you read the WASM spec literally, it looks like you're copying the whole stack on every instruction, but that's just because that was a nice, clean way to specify it. You design it so that way the specification concepts evaporate and the compiler optimizes, and the intermediate copies don't happen. So I found sometimes when talking through specific examples and like walking through every step, people say, oh, well, I thought an extra whole copy happened here, and it doesn't. So especially for these, single component talking to the host. For component, yeah, a copy tends to happen between two linear memories, but even that one, I think there are cool cases, particularly using the SWAM or shared heaps feature, which I think we can actually potentially standardize even in core WASM, and then support in WIT with some sort of buffer type. We can even get that one down to 0 copy. So anyways, I think this is why it's useful to plot out the different use cases, because that streaming pipeline is very different shaped than I just want to efficiently bulk move in and bytes from my storage or my network, where I think we're already pretty good, to your point, Oscar, especially with 0.3.
So this is Mal Harriman. I'm Schneider Electric, brand new here, first time actually. So you're speaking exactly the kind of stuff that we're looking at right now. About to go into performance testing to try to figure out, to benchmark some functions through WASI, and try to figure out what we can do with them for real time. We see WASM is very applicable for embedded. Now the question is, where can we use it? And, can it go all the way down to motion? So, I'm on the industrial side, doing industrial controls and all this kind of stuff. So it's really hard real time. It will be statically linked. Everything that we'll do will be statically linked. So being able to have the ABI, dynamically reconnect, not as important to us, but very concerned about latency and even more so about non-determinism as we're going through the WASI.
Good to hear, Merrill. I think very similar to us. And but to Duke's point, yeah, I mean, one of the things everybody I've spoken to who sat down to try and read the WASI spec has gone, oh, I think I got it. I haven't got it. There's more to get. There's a lot. What's going on? And perhaps would it be fair to say, hey, coming out of this document is also, hey, is there a way to simplify these specs to make it more human readable, so that we avoid this confusion going forward?
Yeah, that's something that's definitely possible. It's just, yeah, there historically hasn't been nearly as much effort going into the documentation, which is a little bit rough. It's mostly people who are working on it, the ones who are deploying it, and so all the context is right up here. But I think we do need to get better about documenting all of this and trying to have the easy way to explain, hey, here's how all these different pieces work. Here's how these things fit together, because it is a lot to take in and understand. And we sort of have that for the proposals where there's like an overview explainer and then the more technical one, but sometimes even the overview explainer is still pretty technical.
Yeah, that'd be good. Yeah, and I think overall, if there's one of the things we've seen, things that we can imagine seeing outside of the embedded space, where you're running something that has additional memory footprint or additional copying, would be, and we've seen it in some cases, where we get additional cache thrashing on some of the larger processors we tested out on, where the cache is getting thrashed between different cores, and we're not using cache pinning per core, and we can see a lot of thrashing going on, kind of a memory footprint noisy neighbor effect occurring. You'd get that happening. You'd probably get a lot of paging to disk and performance and jitter appearing, and we saw some of that when the cache gets under a lot of pressure, and we've seen that with some WebAssembly workloads that we've pushed out. So you can sort of see the side effects of some of this starting to appear here, and I imagine that they wouldn't just appear for embedded workloads. You'd see those in a cloud server too, with jitter and weird spikes and response times for client queries, and memory page faults occurring here and there for it. So you can imagine that that's probably going to happen on the server side too. So, anything we look at here, I think, the benefits aren't just limited to what we're doing from a real-time physical control world, but it'll ripple through to everything else. So, and that'll be a good thing for everybody.
Yeah, I think one benefit of all this, and I don't know if we called it out earlier, is that in the Bytecode Alliance, we're trying to like encourage implementation, collaborating on implementations, right? There's a whole side of this that's like spec related, and we kind of like dive into that. We need to decouple the spec stuff from the implementation stuff, but in the cases in which we can collaborate, and I was just like adding a blurb here in the chat, right? In the cases where we can't collaborate, we should, really collaborate, right? There's not tens of thousands of developers working on WASI SDK, right? There's not tens of thousands of developers working on WAMR or Wasmtime or any of the tools that we use to just like make the ecosystem work, right? Like it's a relatively small set of developers, and the more we can help each other out inside the Bike Alliance. I think, but on the implementation side, right? I'm just saying, the more we can implement together, the better, right? I think we all benefit. Kind of echo your comment there, Chris.
Yeah, and I think, well, so there's going to be, I imagine, I'm thinking as we move towards solution space for some of the points raised in the document. So we're going to have folks going to market or in market with preview 1, 0.1, and we'll have the contributions towards an RC1, YZ 1.0 in the future. Now, for some folks, the commitment towards like an LTS for 0.1 or for WAMA, if we say WAMA LTS, that's an easy sell, right? That's an easy sell. The return on investment for investing in the future, I know is there, but I sometimes have difficulty getting that buy-in from my stakeholders who look at it and go, well, this is the problem right now, and I've got a window to hit, and that's a problem in the future that I can not address right now because this is my major concern.
Wait, you're saying that the maintaining an LTS for like a long term is that's the hard sell?
Oh, no, that's easy.
Okay, that's the easy part. What's the hard sell then?
The harder sell is getting a commitment towards a direct contribution to RC1 because the timeline isn't clear. When can I use it? If I give you 2 developers, when can I use it in a product? And I can't answer the question. So I have trouble getting that one.
See, for me, like I know I hear that now. Like I understand what you mean. I also think, one of the advantages of going along with the current, right? The current that's headed towards RC1 or whatever, right? Is that you have more partners going along with you. And so your maintenance burden for, let's talk about tool chains. WASI SDK might not be as high because there's other parties interested in advancing WASI SDK to whatever, to the RC1 phase. Whereas what I would be a little bit nervous about is if I snapshotted in time and said, I'm going to support WASI SDK preview 1 this date, not even like a certain date of preview 1, that I might end up alone kind of supporting that, like whatever company I worked for. And maybe that's fine. Maybe there's companies, some of the companies you're talking about are big enough that they're fine maintaining that for whatever. But I just don't want to forget that there is a positive effect to moving along with the current, right?
Oh, I think in this case, you're talking to the converted on that point. The challenge is the stakeholder problem, right? But then the question then is, how do we encourage contributions if there is going to be an LTS? How do we encourage contributions that would, and things that I think would help RC1, maybe not a direct contribution to coding contribution towards RC1, but perhaps here's the spec of what we're looking at. We're defining it in the same IDL. It's something that could be reused. All of that sort of stuff. And that's without me even trying to understand what's going on inside the tool chain, where we can try and make sure we're using the same stuff where we can. You think about it from that point of view, and it's like, okay, we're sharing as much of this burden as we can.
Yeah.
Physically contributing towards it.
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder, I mean, I'd hope that the document would deal like Luke had that proposal to kind of what did you call it, Luke? Like when you create like a single module component, right? That you could unwrap and immediately run as long as you kind of understood the canonical ABI in the host. I think the document should handle that a little bit more, because that route seems to allow running P2 components in WAMR or maybe P3 component. Like we kind of got to deal with that fact. Like there is a path there, and it's not going to be implemented. Like Luke's not going to implement it, right? Like, someone could pick up that plan and move it a step further, and that would keep you along the current, or there's parts of that would keep the implementation along the current that other people are contributing to, right? It'd be the same shared pool.
Yeah, I think for a lot of the folks I've been speaking to for this, it's like, hey, yeah, we have 0.1. We're going to run 0.1, but at some point, and even if these performance concerns aren't addressed, let's imagine they aren't. There's going to be this whole library of software that exists in components they're going to want to consume, right? It would be a standard, it would be a component, we're going to want to use it. It might be less in the control space, but it might be alongside the control space. You get this in practical use cases for this, or IoT devices in a shop floor that have a web interface for configuration, right? I'm going to want to run some web interface to set this thing up, and it's, hey, I'm going to run a reuse code because I don't want to re-implement a web server, and I'm going to, if I can use WASI HTTP and I'll have it done, and it's just make it really easy, right? I want to store some information, my configuration information, in a small database. Maybe it's MySQL database or something, right? All of that is prime time use case for reusable code, right? And if it's all there in a component and I can just pick it up and use it, yeah, this makes perfect sense. Let's go and do that. Maybe not even in the control space. So even when we're thinking about the component model and the performance, even if it doesn't meet the control loop requirements, it doesn't mean it's not useful. It's just going to be useful in a different scenario. And I think Meryl was asking that, like, where can we use it? Where does this make sense? Does it make, and maybe a question for us all is, does it make sense to have a component in the control loop? Or do you just say the component sits outside the control loop and you run core WASM for the control loop, and you can put the component outside it?
I think it makes sense in the control loop, but it may take some work to get to that point. I don't know. We'll have to measure.
Right. And even if we're not successful at RC1 or release 1, it doesn't mean it's not going to be useful and it can't still be a goal. It's just, from an architecture point of view, you would say, well, here's core WASM and here's the component, and you don't put the component in here unless you can afford to. So put it over there. And at some point in the future, we'd love you to be able to put it in there, but it's.
Yeah, you're highlighting like an important point, that whatever design, before someone puts one of these WASM systems into production for the next 20 years, they should hopefully design in a way that's forward compatible, that they can kind of in the future, use components or use different previews or whatever. All the examples you gave, Chris, right? Like that should be an important consideration when designing, because we know that this is like a changing ecosystem.
Yeah, and I think when we looked at, I think the document kind of touches on it, and hopefully we can break this out in a separate solution space, and maybe even in part of sort of the core requirements, because we know there's going to be a long-term support requirement, and some of us who are going to market with it are going to have to provide it. So if we can share that burden, great. So there's going to be a long-term support requirement. There's going to be maybe adding some features in there. But there's also going to be a requirement that in the future, we, even on these old runtimes, and this is the stuff you mentioned, Andrew, that Luke had proposed, and I think there's further discussions on how that might be done, how we can run a component on a non-component enabled runtime, and what that would
look. Some way, because 15 years from now, who knows? Like, if it's not components, it's something else, right? We're going to have to be able to. You'd imagine that time will change things, and we'll need to be able to kind of, the system needs to be flexible enough to adapt to that.
Right. I mean, it does, and there is scope for that adaptation. I think we should think about it. And there are points that will come where it will be just, hey, you know what? This runtime's just a little bit too old, right? And there are companies out there that you have to boot Windows 95 to get a compiler that operates for their chosen in market solution, right? It exists because things move on, and sometimes you're stuck with an old tool chain for a little bit. So, but there are practical limits to it, is what I'm saying. I think we should totally engineer for it, but solving this problem for everything is maybe a stretch too far. Maybe we should put some practical limitations on it as well. Put some guide rails on it that says this is our definition of success. And I think I've been talking so much, I didn't even notice we're over time. So, folks, I really appreciate all the feedback so far. This has been really good, actually. And I thoroughly appreciate the input and the document and the comments. The presence here and the chat on the call has been great. I know, depending on where you are, it's either really early in the morning in Asia, or it's really coming up to 9 p.m. on the East Coast. It's getting late. So thank you for the time outside of normal office hours. Really appreciated. Next steps, I think for me, I'd love to get that document just kind of finished, out of the way, because I want to get on to the much more interesting conversations that we've touched on today. I would love to, as soon as possible, get just the sort of LTS requirements, some of the 0.1 requirements out as a, hey, this is what the embedded community needs, and the long-term support is what the embedded community needs. And there are these other options. How we are going to solve those, we don't know, but they're there. And get that kind of delivered to the wider standards group as a statement of requirement for us in the embedded community, and then have a kind of follow-on afterwards on how we could go about addressing those. And I would certainly want to follow up with Dan and Alex and Sam about what that tool chain looks like, and try and tease out some information there. That would be fantastic. Would there be any objection to me wrapping up this document and getting it, closing this PR in the near term? Any folks want a couple of days to add their further comments to it? I'll post up on Zulip, see if we can drive it forward a little bit, because I would like to finish the long PR discussion and get on with more interesting stuff. Wow, the concrete.
I think,
more interesting.
yeah, I'm fine with that. I'll take another look at I think you tried to fix the tool chain. We had that whole discussion about the tool. I think that should be pretty much fixed. I think maybe Luke I saw many comments by Luke and several others. Hope that's all resolved.
I think I got them, but I don't know for sure. And if I haven't, it's just lost in the noise, Luke. So shout out and I'll fix it. But I apologize if I've missed some. So yeah, I'll give it a couple of days. I'll post it up in Zulip, and hopefully before the end of this week we can just close out that PR, and I can start working on those 2 tasks that we've got set aside. That would be great. Get the first one done. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Unless there's any other comments, I'm going to hit the end of the record button. 3, 2, 1, gone.